Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. Yet again, we're in the Bundestag together with Senator Richard Black. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation for the interview, Senator Black.
Thank you very much.
With us, we also have Mr. Moldorf, who is a member of parliament from the Alternative für Deutschland, AFD group. Thank you also very much for joining this discussion.
Thank you.
You might know, we've already presented in the previous interview with Professor Harold Weil. We are here on the invitation, a wonderful roundtable, very informative. Yesterday we had that roundtable with the Senator speaking, among other people as well, from the AFD. Senator, so you've been in the Virginia State Senate, you've been a member of the Senate, you also have plenty of experience, and we listened very carefully to the roundtable. You had a very interesting thing to say. Tell us a little bit about your stay in Berlin. You're here on the invitation of AFD. How is it unfolding?
Yeah, it's unfolding very well. AFD has been most gracious to let me explain my views. They're not the views of the AFD. I mean, some of them probably overlap, but in any event, people have been very courteous, very gracious to hear my thoughts. And you know, I analyze these things rather carefully, and so we've had a great discussion.
Wonderful. And how is it for the AFD to have?
It was a great pleasure to listen to him, and of course, as he might know, our position in this special point of the political outcome of these days is a bit of an opposition position, and sometimes it's very helpful to get the support from outside, and that was exactly what it was yesterday evening. And you have seen that the people enjoyed it as much as I did, and yeah, thank you for coming again.
Thank you.
Yesterday, Senator, you in the roundtable you mentioned the Ukraine-Russia conflict. This was the topic of discussion, and you said something very interesting, that the conflict has not started actually at the 24th of February, but long time prior this date. Is this correct?
Yes, that's exactly true. It really goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. At that point, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and unfortunately, NATO did not. NATO stayed a very robust organization, looking in search of a mission, and at that point, they sort of created this image, this illusion that the new Russian Federation was a generic substitute for the old Soviet Union, which it really was not. And so they began advancing, they began acquiring new countries and moving steadily eastward. And finally they reached the border of Ukraine. And then in 2014, the Ukrainian president was President Yanukovych, I'm mispronouncing. But anyway, he was ousted in a violent revolutionary coup that was in large measure prompted and organized by the Central Intelligence Agency and British MI6. And so they overthrew the government, and at that point there was a revolutionary junta who took over. Poroshenko was elected as their first president after the coup, and he was extremely nationalistic, and one of the things he did is he changed the constitution of Ukraine. The constitution had said there were two national languages. The first was Ukrainian. The second one was Russian. He deleted Russian, which effectively made Russians, because Russians, they spoke Russian within Ukraine. About 30% were Russian speaking. So all of a sudden they sort of became second-class citizens. They had to have interpreters to do ordinary types of business. So the Russian-speaking areas were very displeased by the revolution that had overthrown the president. They helped to elect the president, and now all of a sudden he's overthrown, and now they've got to listen to this group of revolutionaries. And Crimea and the Donbass, which is two republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. Anyway, all of them declared their independence. They refused to be governed by this revolutionary junta. And at that point, the new president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, launched attacks on the Donbass. He didn't do it on the Crimea, but he did it on the Donbass. That was a war that has killed 14,000 people in the Donbass since 2014, all the way up until the Russians finally came in. So it was a pretty big war. And Germany and France saw that there was a danger, and they organized the Minsk conference, and in 2014, 2015, agreements were signed by Ukraine and by the two Donbass republics, and the Ukraine agreed that they would grant semi-autonomy to the Donbass area. However, the next thing that happened is the United States began flooding advanced arms into Ukraine. And so there was really no incentive for Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement. Instead, they moved towards war. And so this is where we found ourselves. Now, I'll back up just a little bit. In 2008, so this is six years before the revolution, Ambassador Burns, who was the ambassador of the United States to Russia, issued a cable. It was a classified cable that went to NATO, went to all over Washington, and in it he warned, he said that he had had discussions with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and that Lavrov had told him that that this was an enormously, the movement of Ukraine into NATO was enormously emotional, and he described it as a neuralgic event. And a neuralgic pain is one that just shoots through your face. It's almost, it paralyzes you. And he used that word to describe just how dramatic the antipathy was towards Ukraine joining NATO. Part of the problem, had Ukraine joined with NATO, the area where Ukraine and Russia have their defense plants, they manufacture artillery, tanks, things like that, it was operated cooperatively between Ukraine and Russia. And had Ukraine become part of NATO, NATO obviously was a hostile force in the view of Russia, and suddenly the weapons plants of Russia would be kind of an enemy-controlled territory. That's the way the Russians looked at it. So Ambassador Burns laid out in detail, very clearly, the danger. He said this is likely to lead to violence, and he said even to civil war. And of course this is what has happened. And then he said that if it led to violence and to civil war, it would put Russia in the unpleasant position of having to decide whether to intervene, whether to attack in order to rescue the Russian-speaking people in Donbass. Exactly what happened. Exactly. And so here we are, 2014, 2015, Germany, France, they understood the dangers, and they tried to ward it off with the Minsk peace agreements, but they were never implemented. Then the Ukrainian people did not want war. And by 2019, they had become very dissatisfied with President Poroshenko because he kept making war. They were looking for a peace candidate. And this is when they sought out Mr. Zelensky. And Zelensky ran as a peace candidate. And when he was elected, April 21st of 2019, he stood up in front of the crowd and he said, now, he said, we're going to reboot the negotiations to implement the Minsk agreements. And he said, now we will achieve peace. And the crowd roared. They were ecstatic. They wanted peace. But Zelensky did not take that direction. He took direction, I suspect, from Washington. And he pursued the path of war. And at this point, Russia had, they were quite desperate to ward this war off, to avoid it. And so in December of 21, President Putin and Ambassador Lavrov, or Minister Lavrov, put specific written proposals on the table to Russia, or to NATO, I'm sorry, and proposing to NATO that they create a peaceful zone within Europe. Now, it was a negotiating position. Not everything would have been accepted, but NATO just blew it off and ignored it. By the time that they ignored it, Russia had waited and waited and waited for the response. By then, the ground was thawing. It was terrible weather to launch an attack because their tanks and their wheeled vehicles could not go off-road, so they were channelized and bunched up. And then they attacked under very strict rules of engagement, where they were not to damage property, they were not to kill people when they could possibly avoid it. And then it just didn't work out for the Russians. They turned out that the Ukrainians had tremendously strong resistance, and then from then on the war has unfolded into a very brutal contest between both sides.
Let's take a look more in the past. In the beginning of the 90s of the last century, we had the situation that the former United countries or United States of the former Soviet Union had a referendum at the same day with all the people in Russia. The Russian referendum was about sovereignty of Russia as a new country. And the other question, the referendum of the people of all Soviet Union was, do you want to stay as a state society together? And both referendums ended with yes. And this is a conflict. And you go to back to the Second World War, then you see that the nation of Ukraine is just two nations in the border of one. So you have the Western Ukraine during the World War II. They were standing with the Germans because they liberated Western Ukraine from Stalin. And you have East Ukraine, and this is absolutely influenced by Russian thinking, by Russian culture, Russian language. And so was the situation until 2014. And of course, was Senator Black described, was the reality. The former family of my wife came from there, and we have all the relationship to people of both sides. And they closed schools, they prohibited newspapers, TV channels, radio stations. They removed all the people with a Russian background from well-paid positions in the state, and they do not allow to have leading perspectives in the country. And it was a question of about weeks, months, or years that all this conflict will end as it ended now. And the thing that we have was absolutely visible for the last 10 or 20 years, but unfortunately in Western Europe nobody would like to recognize it. And the question behind this is why? Why? And I told Senator Black that I used the part of the speech from Zbigniew Brzezinski as a national security advisor from the former President Jimmy Carter. And he described that Ukraine as a nation is needed to hold Russian down. And it is, he called it a torpedo against Russian and the restoration of the former Soviet Union. And maybe this is a kind of thinking very helpful to understand the situation that we have now.
Mr. Mosdorf, you said that you welcome very much the support, as you described it, of Senator Black with his speech yesterday and the points and the arguments he brought about, because you said you're in stiff opposition in the Bundestag.
Sometimes.
Could you please tell us a little bit more about the position of sometimes of AFD on this issue? Could you please formulate the position of AFD on the war of the conflict in Ukraine, and also put it in the perspective that Germany, together with France, was supposed to be a kind of a guarantor of peace and the Minsk peace talks, and Germany quite failed, together with France, to bring the Minsk process any step further. We've been talking about the Minsk process for how long? 7 years now? 7.5? And this process has brought us to war, so clearly hasn't worked, and Germany was part of this guarantee. So please formulate briefly the position of AFD in Parliament. What is your stance and German position as a guarantor?
I will start with your second question first. It's very simple. Of course, all the Europeans, what we had on the side of negotiations with other countries, including Russia and Ukraine, was completely dismissed from people in the government of the United States. And all these advices, especially to the Ukrainian side, just came from Washington. And when you look just, I would say, 5 months backwards, there was a conference in Geneva, and there was on the table Russia, the United States, the UN, and Ukraine, but not the EU, and not Germany, and not France. Very simple. The other question is that, of course, we see that the aggression of war is not a common politics in the 21st century, of course. And all the other parties have the therapy for the situation now that we deliver an amazing amount of weapons to the Ukrainian people. And of course, they expect a long ongoing war because they do not describe what should be the end of all that. Are this the Minsk protocol, or is it just put Russia to a very, very bad situation for the next century? Or is it to end the war with a much bigger Ukraine as a part of the Western world? For now, they focused only the situation that we support Ukraine to their own liberation as part of maybe the former bigger European Union. But behind these goals is something visible, but something is not visible. And the most interesting thing is what is not visible. And it has to do with a complete new world order. We talked about yesterday about the petrodollar system. You know that a lot of wars in the past 70 years were taken from the United States to countries they do not agree furthermore to use the American dollar system to pay their petrol or gas or any bills. And we have now the situation that the largest countries in the world, Russia, China, India, the Middle East countries, and the BRICS states, decided to break this monopole. And this is the goal, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention. We will continue in our second part. I thank you very much, Mr. Moosdorf, and we will carry on in a minute.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second part. We're here with Senator Black. We'll continue the conversation from where we stopped. Senator, you mentioned the development of the war and the conflict in Ukraine. Is there something that surprised you in this conflict from both sides, from the Ukrainian and the Russians? Does something unexpected happen that surprised you?
Well, I was a little bit surprised by the approach that President Putin took initially, because you may recall this is kind of a famous photo where there's a Russian tank that was stopped in the road, and there are, a couple dozen civilians out there, and they wouldn't let the tank go by, and so the tank stopped. I was surprised by the very gentle rules of engagement. In other words, President Putin, he had this hope that Ukraine would fall very quickly. He didn't want to damage anything. He didn't want to damage any infrastructure. He didn't want to kill people. So that surprised me. It struck me as a little unrealistic. When they parachuted a company in close to the capital, that struck me as unrealistically hopeful. And I think what it was, and I've read some writings by President Putin, and I think he's a little bit of a victim of his own experience with his own culture, the Russian culture, which does not focus quite so much on the terrible brutality of Lenin and Stalin, although he has condemned it. I mean, President Putin has condemned communism in the harshest language. But I think when you read these writings, it's sort of like, well, that happened, but here's the greatness of Russia, which you can understand. If you're a Russian, if you're writing for the Russian people, you want them to feel good about themselves. And I think to some extent he believed this idea of the brotherhood of Slavic nations, where in truth there was some very bitter history between the Soviet Union and Ukraine. And so I was a little bit surprised by how gentle the initial attack was, which made it an ineffective attack. But I was not surprised that President Putin very quickly changed course, recognized that they were not going to succeed the way that they had tried it. They refocused their efforts away from the capital and down to the Donbass, and their idea is to destroy the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, because this is where the elites of the army are, the people who are battle-hardened, trained, the Ukrainian troops who are very, very good troops. And at this point, the Russian army is just chewing them to pieces. And I did computations comparing Vietnam, which was our last really bloody war that the US fought, with what's going on. And on a per capita basis, in proportion to the populations that we had during Vietnam and that Ukraine has today, the casualty rate, the killed in action rate, is 60 times as high for Ukraine as it was for the United States. So they have pivoted very effectively, and I don't think these are casualty rates that the Ukrainian army can sustain for very long. I think I think they are essentially finished. I don't think they have much chance of prevailing at this point. And because of that, and I don't, you know, I don't have a heart for either side. I mean, I have a heart for both sides. When I see these young men, I mean, they look like the folks that I fought with in Vietnam. They're, you know, great kids going off. Their countries tell them this is what you should do on both sides. And at this point, I think there's just a needless slaughter of particularly Ukrainian. Now, initially, the Russians took a beating with the gentle approach they had up around the capital. But now that they've moved, we have a very vicious artillery duel where the Russians are able to fire 10 times as many shells as the Ukrainians. And it just seems that it's time to come to the peace table to stop the slaughter, because we're just destroying the lives of precious people. So, you know, I see that there are different people who are speaking out in favor of peace. Former Secretary of State Kissinger said that it was time for Ukraine to be prepared to give up land and to make peace with Russia. And then you had a statement by the deputy intelligence chief for the Ukrainian army who said that Russia could very easily win the war. And then finally you had NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who appeared to be admitting defeat, and he says it's really just a matter of how much land do you give up, how much sovereignty, how much independence do you have to give up to make peace. Now, I must say that he backtracked within a day or two, and now he says that we're in this for the long haul, we're going to have a long war. So I don't want to mischaracterize, but this is what he originally said. But at this point, I think it's time to gather around the peace table and put the war to an end.
You bring us a wonderful topic, peace. I think that there is not one sensible man who does not want peace here and now. There is, and this whole conference that we had yesterday, the round table, it was all about peace. None of us wants to see slaughter. I'm sure, especially you've seen plenty of slaughter in the war in Vietnam. As you said, it literally breaks the heart when you watch young men die for whatever cause, but just to see young individuals dead, it is heartbreaking. So we are all focused on peace. You remember that in the beginning, Zelensky himself said, we are ready to do concessions for a peace with Russia. There were 4 or 5 rounds of talks in the first 10 days of conflict, or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I can't remember exactly, but we clearly remember the genuine effort, it so appeared, of peace. Ever since, we've lost that trade, that initiative is gone, and I don't hear Zelensky speak about peace anymore. We don't see rounds of discussions. And only 2 or 3 days ago, he said, we'll fight till the end, and we're going to recapture the entire coast of Ukraine, including Crimea. I'm not so sure this has anything to do with the realities on the ground, but that's what he said, and obviously he doesn't speak, he's the head of state. My question is multifold. We all want peace, there are no peace talks. Russia may win the war, they say, but maybe it's not ready to win the peace. What will the world look like? Some say it will not be unipolar anymore. It will become at least bipolar or multipolar world. The hegemony of the United States, they say, is coming to an end. Is Russia ready to win the peace? Even if it wins the war, is it ready to win the peace? Do we have a sustainable way to peace? How can peace happen? How will the peace look like? And also, if peace means that the United States has to lose its hegemony, does the United States have an actionable plan, not just words, actionable plan on how will its place be in a non-unipolar world? So, sorry, it's a multifold question, but it's where we want to bring.
Yeah. Well, the war in Ukraine has very much threatened the U.S. Dollar hegemony. It already had been showing some signs of wear, but it's accelerated now. And part of it is that President Biden swore that we would destroy the ruble, we would throw the Russian economy into chaos, that they couldn't trade. And all of this has played out, and none of it has come true, because the ruble is the strongest in 7 years, and the Russians have new strengthened trade ties with India, with China, with Brazil, with Saudi Arabia, with a number of countries, important, South Africa, and even Turkey, a member of NATO, has, they've just declined to impose the sanctions. Turkey is always going in its own direction. And so the trade hasn't worked. The sanctions are backfiring. The Russians now have a balance of trade that's double what it was last year. Their trade surplus is double. And meanwhile, all of the people in Russia, all the common people, they have their rent is fine. They get their food. They get their petrol. All of the things, all the essentials of life are available. There are no shortages. And so the fact that this has happened, I think, it's a little bit of a blow towards the dollar dominance. The fact that Russia has not engaged in widespread money printing. Since President Biden was elected, we have printed a phenomenal $10 trillion, which is just, it's very difficult to even conceive of the amount of money you're talking about. Meanwhile, Russia has a gold-backed currency. You can't exchange it for gold, but nations can. And they have a debt to GDP ratio that's less than 20%. They're one of the 14 most solvent nations in the world, of all of the countries. And so we look at it and we see they had a blip of inflation that took them up to 15%, and now their inflation rate is declining. And meanwhile, in the West, the United States, Europe, the inflation rate is soaring. It's soaring dangerously. So I think all of these things, the dislocation of the value of the dollar, the fact that it's difficult to really gauge what is the value of a dollar anymore with the rate of inflation. We don't know from day to day. And I think that undermines the status of the dollar as the dominant reserve currency. We still have a long ways to go, but I think we're already seeing lots of trade going with rubles, with the yuan, between Russia, China, India, other countries. And so there's this alternative currency that's emerging that really it wouldn't have emerged nearly this way if it hadn't been for the Ukrainian war. So the war has badly injured the value of the US dollar. I think again it becomes imperative that we achieve peace and that we do it as quickly as possible. I think that we should look to the example of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, where Austria was basically pulled out of the Cold War. Soviet Union withdrew, all of the Allied occupying forces withdrew, and in exchange, Austria changed its constitution and said we will be neutral, non-aligned with either side, and we will never allow foreign troops on our soil. If we did that, it would be a tremendous boon both to Western Europe and to Russia, because it would create a buffer that would make it much less likely that we would have nuclear accidents. Right now, we're getting to where we are literally toe-to-toe. If we bring NATO, if we bring Ukraine into NATO, we have created an existential threat for Russia. And at any moment, we will have the capacity of launching a surprise nuclear attack that destroys the country. Now, you'd like to say, well, that would never happen, but U.S. Republican Senator Weicker, a very prominent guy, has said that we should not rule out the use of a first strike, that means a surprise attack. And he says the U.S. should not rule out putting American troops on the ground in Ukraine, fighting in Ukraine. This, in my view, is insanity because we've never had an all-out nuclear exchange. We saw what it did in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the vast destruction, but the bombs today are 100 times stronger, and there are vast numbers of them. And some people say that, well, we should be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Once we fire the first nuclear weapon, the chances that there will be an escalation that will eventually destroy the entire world are very high. So we need some sane voices to restore the situation that we have, to avoid World War III and avoid a nuclear war.
And then, of course, come some people who say, well, Ukraine has its own sovereignty. They have the right to their own choice and follow the Euro-Atlantic dreams to join NATO and the EU. How would you respond to that argument? Because you call it the buffer nation, they will say, we don't want to be a buffer nation, we have our sovereignty.
I would respond by saying that the theoretical sovereignty of Ukraine relative to the death of a third or a half of the entire human population, that theory of sovereignty is nothing. Go back to the First World War, 1914, there was an assassination of two people, okay? The Archduke of Austro-Hungary and his wife were both assassinated. Before long, nations piled on and treaties were triggered, and in the end you had 14 million people who died to get even for two people being assassinated. Now, if they'd never even put it in the newspaper that it happened, nobody would have even known it. It wasn't that relevant. It's the same thing when we talk about the theoretical sovereignty of Ukraine. I'm not sure that Ukraine is sovereign at all. I think Ukraine is under instructions from Washington. Perhaps the Azov battalion, perhaps, who knows? But there are reasons that Zelensky does not have maneuvering room. And so I think the sovereignty of Ukraine is a fiction. And here we are talking about risking the entire global population for some theoretical nicety, and it's just not worth it. I mean, sovereignty would be great, and self-determination would be great, but if it comes to that or nuclear war, I don't care the slightest bit about their sovereignty or their, things like that. I want to stop the war. That's my objective. That's my concern.
Senator Black, one question. You told us you're a former US Marine. You fought in Vietnam. Republican from the state of Virginia. You told us yesterday that you're a patriotic, American patriot. Could you please tell us, given the fact that the geopolitics is changing, there are tectonical plates in the movement, and there is establishing of a new global order, perhaps. Where do you see the United States in this whole new order? Is there a place for three big players, if we can say that United States, Russia, and China are now in the main focus as the key big players? And yeah, what's next in the whole geopolitical context?
I think in the short term, there's a great risk for the United States of an explosion of inflation with the dollar. Mm-hmm. One that will be politically destabilizing. I can't say for sure that will happen, but historically, if you look at what happened in the Weimar Republic, if you look what happened during the French Revolution, you can go all the way back to Roman times. Governments disintegrate as a result of inflation. And I think there is, in the intermediate term, let's call it, there is a possibility of a great deal of destabilization and so forth. At some point, hopefully, the United States will pull out of this nosedive. It'll take very radical measures to do it. But once they have done this, the United States has certain inherent assets that will make it a great power in the future. Great Britain has been protected by the 21-mile span of ocean, which is the English Channel. We have 5,000 or 6,000 miles of open ocean between any possible enemy and ourselves. It is so daunting, the idea that someone could actually conquer the United States. It's just almost inconceivable, short of nuclear weapons. We have tremendous natural resources. We're not that affected by the sanctions compared to Europe, because we have coal, we have oil, natural gas, we have iron ore, all of the things we need for a great industrial society. But Europe does not have these. They don't have those resources. They have it's been required for them to get those principally from Russia. A lot of them anyway. And so we have these inherent strengths that will go on even if there's tremendous political turmoil. The possibility of resuming a position of power will remain. So I hope that in the course of all of this that Europe doesn't just take a horrible beating from the currency fluctuations that will take place.
Senator, being here in Berlin, yesterday you mentioned something that you said I don't quote you word by word, but the sense was that you're perplexed by the position of Germany, and you have strong suspicions that its sovereignty lies not in Berlin, but rather in London and mostly in Washington. And you said that this is horrible for Germany itself and for all parties involved. Could you please expand briefly on why exactly is the sovereignty of Germany not in Berlin? And if it's in Washington, how is this also bad for Washington? I could not quite grasp your point. Mm-hmm. Why is this also negative for Washington?
Well, I think that Germany has made certain decisions, and probably let's just focus on the biggest one. They spent 11 years building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This would make the flow of gas, natural gas, to Germany and other parts of Europe very reliable. And they went through this enormous process. It was tremendously expensive to do the pipeline. The Germans and the Russians worked together. There were other countries involved. And it was literally finished. The entire pipeline was finished and ready for someone to throw the switch and turn it on. And at that point, the United States brought pressure on Germany, and they were forced to stop. Now, that gas pipeline would have probably improved the gross domestic product of Germany by several percentage points permanently. Now, that's just a guess on my part. Some economists would tell you, no, that's not quite right. But it's reasonable, I think. And so they've given this up, and they've given it up under pressure from the United States. If you look at the efforts, kind of desperate efforts that France and Germany made at the Minsk peace agreements to achieve peace and to avoid war, they did so successfully. They got agreements signed, and then the decision was made, and I think it was made in Washington, that those agreements were not going to be observed, that the U.S. began funneling weapons in, and once we did, it created a problem for Russia that ultimately led to the war. Even though the decision to go to war was made in Washington. The decision to attack was made in Russia. But once we made the decision to go to war, the decision to attack was inevitable. It wasn't something that President Putin sat around dreaming about all the time. It was something that I don't think he wanted it at all. I don't think he wanted to deal with this issue. But he was forced into it, and now we see it's turning into a disaster for all kinds of people. So we need to figure a way to get out of it, pull out of the nosedive, and get ourselves flying straight and even again.
Senator Black, I would like to thank you on behalf of our media channel for your time today with us. I would like to thank the Alternative for Germany for the invitation and the polite invitation that they gave us with all the infrastructure for the filming. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation for this interview. Dear viewers, we are very glad and grateful that you stayed with us this entire interview. We hope it was useful, and we hope to see you again, and we hope to be here in Berlin again. Senator, thank you once more.
Thank you, and my best to all of your listeners in Bulgaria.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much.